Hi, I'm Zetetic. If you follow Kickstarter campaigns, or if you saw E3, or if you watched my YouTube channel lately, or if you watched me through my window while I played Dark Deity, you've probably heard of Dark Deity. It's a tactical role-playing game. In the Kickstarter material and in promotions for the game posted in places like Reddit, Dark Deity's developers describe themselves as inspired by games like Fire Emblem and a mystery game I've covered up with a stretched-out picture of Ramza from Final Fantasy Tactics. Naturally, this sparked a great deal of excitement within the Fire Emblem community. But what is inspiration? The most prolific children's author I could think of that isn't a transphobic asshole, R.L. Stine, was inspired to write when he had read Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, a book about a kid that sneaks out of his house at night and experiences the horrors of an evil traveling circus. He was spooked, and he decided that he would spook other children by writing the Goosebumps series, which all feature horror, fantasy, and supernatural elements. Then you have people like Eric Barone, also known as Concerned Ape. He started to feel that one of his favorite video game series, Harvest Moon, was declining in quality and limiting the player in ways he thought was unnecessary. So he learned everything about every aspect of game development and created Stardew Valley, which is in some ways both a labor of love and an improvement on the Harvest Moon games. And then there's Brian Fetter and Ben Kane, the creators of Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, a party game about defusing a bomb while your friends translate the instruction manual for you. They were inspired to create video games by Starcraft and Half-Life, games that don't involve defusing a bomb at all. Well, they have things that explode, I guess. But anyway, these games featured companion programs like the Starcraft Campaign Editor and the Valve Hammer Editor, which enabled people to create their own levels in these games. In some ways, the passion behind Dark Deity can be traced back to one of these three broad subtypes of inspiration. It's pretty clear that the developers of Dark Deity are Fire Emblem fans and wanted people who enjoyed Fire Emblem to enjoy their game. There are signs that they tried to improve on Fire Emblem's formula, or at least differentiate themselves from Fire Emblem with their own ideas. And there are also signs that Dark Deity's creators were inspired by the level of creativity Fire Emblem allows its players. The other inspiration for Dark Deity was, of course, Final Fantasy Tactics, a game that is nothing like Fire Emblem at all. Logic would dictate that Dark Deity couldn't be both like Fire Emblem and Final Fantasy Tactics, given how different these two games are from one another. Sure, they both play on grids, they both have the class systems, and they both have nobles that deserve to be executed, but they are otherwise not much alike at all. So, in theory, Dark Deity should have stood on its own 2 feet. Yet, many reviews for the game in one way or another compare Dark Deity to Fire Emblem. Positive reviews call it Fire Emblem for the PC. They say that Dark Deity is the successor to Fire Emblem, and they call it a competent Fire Emblem clone. These reviews put their focus on the most superficial similarities between Dark Deity and Fire Emblem. Stuff like the grid-based maps and the I Go, You Go turn system that Fire Emblem and other early tactical RPGs derives from board games played on boards, like the cleverly named Tactics and Raid on Iran, what the fuck? To some degree, these superficial comparisons make sense from a game journalism perspective. The average video game player, not to be confused with the average gamer, gamers are weird, is not familiar with every single Fire Emblem game, surprisingly enough. They might think of Fire Emblem as a game that features grid-based battles and some form of permadeath. So saying that Dark Deity is a Fire Emblem clone is sort of a shorthand for a game that is generally arranged and presented like Fire Emblem is. There aren't many negative reviews of Dark Deity in major publications, but Steam reviews, YouTube videos, and the like do criticize Dark Deity. I'm not going to draw attention to specific reviews because I don't want to criticize random people on the internet when it's not their job to review video games. But the negative reviews that do exist seem to be made by people who are more familiar with Fire Emblem and its growth as a series over time, yet they still seem inclined to compare Dark Deity to Fire Emblem. They say derisively that Dark Deity isn't Fire Emblem, that Dark Deity's developers don't grasp what made Fire Emblem interesting, or that Dark Deity is wearing Fire Emblem's skin in a cynical attempt to trick Fire Emblem fans into buying it. Dark Deity is, of course, not Fire Emblem, and the trend to compare new games to the games that came before them is harmful in a few ways. For one, it sets expectations for new games that are way too high for the typical small developer team to reach. Very few indie developers have the funds or the skills to make their first game almost indistinguishable from AAA quality productions. Secondly, these comparisons narrow the definition of inspiration so severely that the word becomes a synonym for copying a bigger game developer's homework. Thirdly, these comparisons only go one way. There's no consideration for the possibility that a newer game improved on an older game's formula, it's just assumed that the newer game is a clone of the older one. Let's turn it around then. Many people have answered the question, is Dark Deity like Fire Emblem? What I want to answer is Fire Emblem like Dark Deity? And the answer is yes. Here's why. Dark Deity features the Advantage system, a group of 9 attack types that have varying effectiveness against 4 armor types. But each class in Dark Deity has 1 attack type, though a couple of classes have 2, and each class has 1 armor type. Since there's no way for characters to switch around which attack and armor types they have outside of promotion, the advantage system is essentially just a class matching game. Attack enemies with the most effective classes, and avoid effective damage from enemies by meeting them with the right armor types. In many reviews, Fire Emblem's weapon triangle has been compared to Dark Deity's advantage system. This is a flawed comparison. The advantage system is pretty much the only thing Dark Deity has when it comes to tactical decision making on the battlefield, outside of the special class skills that have varying levels of usefulness. Throughout the Fire Emblem games, the series utilizes the weapon triangle, terrain advantages, effective weaponry, special game-specific mechanics like pair-up and battalions, and a bunch of other stuff. These little building blocks encourage a player to use them to build up larger advantages, mixing and matching them based on a given situation. But Dark Deity's advantage system is pretty much all or nothing. You can choose to ignore it and often get away with it. It's also possible to choose to ignore Fire Emblem's tactical game. In both cases, ignoring the system goes the same way. Focus on training a small team of units, collect the experience meant for 15 to 20 units on 1 to 5 people, and beat everything with your overleveled units with little to no regard for weapon matchups or positioning. Solo runs and low-man runs are fun in their own weird way, but there's no denying that they break down the tactical experience of both of these games and move all the decision-making to the strategic end. The pre-planning for each chapter and for the whole run, the promotions you decide to dole out, weapon upgrades you decide to make, checking what the enemy is wielding so you don't make a stupid mistake, and so on. Sorry, Sigurd. The mathematics under Dark Deity's hood are algebraic monstrosities that are too much of a pain in the ass to use for calculating damage and other stuff ahead of time. Fire Emblem, on the other hand, uses relatively simple formulas to make this easy. Dark Deity's formula design seems intended to make damage and hit and critical rates hard to predict so that you're relying on the advantage system more, or figuring a way around it entirely. You could have Excel open on the side and do your calculations quickly that way, but honestly, if you're going to play a spreadsheet game, you may as well play the spreadsheet game. Fire Emblem can also put you in a position of bogging you down with calculations, especially in games with skills that have a percentage chance to activate, or that introduce complexities like the weapon triangle having a different effect depending on the attacker's weapon level. It's often more convenient for a casual player to just do an action, see what happens, and live with the consequences, or in the last 2 Fire Emblem games, reverse time. Dark Deity also allows you to live with mistakes with a death system that just takes away 10% of a character's stat. Not that bad in the long run. The narratives of Fire Emblem games are much like Dark Deity's. The main story is a quest where kids and their cool grown-up friends have to collect magical artifacts to save the world, and the evil guy is something of a magical artifact collector himself. It's not treading new ground, it's just pretty standard YA fantasy where the kids have to take charge and get in trouble with authority. Dark Deity's world building has some Tolkien-esque elements like big bearded dwarves and leaf-eared elves, but Fire Emblem doesn't. They're still both set in a medieval-era world where 2 or more kingdoms are at war with one another, but the war is a distraction for a bigger plot. The characterization in both games is practically non-existent until you start to unlock bonds, or supports as they're called in Fire Emblem, although you'll never get every single bond in a single playthrough, so good luck running the game multiple times to quote-unquote earn the entire story. Dark Deity's maps are, for the most part, fun to play through at least on the first pass. A few of the maps rely on surprises that don't land in the second playthrough. A few are an absolute slog because they're way bigger and or twistier than they need to be. A few do a poor job of communicating what's expected from the player, what the player should watch out for. Fire Emblem, unfortunately, falls into many of the same map design pitfalls that Dark Deity does. Although on average, I would say that Fire Emblem has about the same percentage of fun maps that Dark Deity does too. As a gamer, I freaked the heck out when I saw the Made with Game Maker splash screen at the beginning of Dark Deity. I was shocked when I learned that an indie game was made in an indie game engine. Fire Emblem's creators, on the other hand, have a very small advantage over Dark Deity's developers, hundreds of millions of dollars. This allows Fire Emblem's developers to create their own engine. This engine allows for stunning visual and lighting effects with very short load times. Dark Deity released with many bugs, some of which were game-breaking. Updates to the game fixed old bugs and introduced new bugs, and playing Dark Deity for the first month after its release was a frustrating experience. I wouldn't blame anyone who requested a refund after seeing it needed more time to cook, because the game really should have been released in early access. Fire Emblem, on the other hand, also releases with many bugs, often game-breaking ones, and almost certainly bugs that will never be fixed by intelligent systems, ever. The difference between Fire Emblem and Dark Deity here is that Dark Deity was made by 6 people with $75,000 to spare, and Intelligent Systems has theoretically raked in hundreds of millions of dollars from the PNG gambling scheme. Guess which team is fixing the bugs faster? This leads me to my conclusion, which I've rewritten and re-recorded a bunch of times because I'm not sure how to say this without sounding like a complete asshole. This video is not a rebuke of valid criticisms about Dark Deity's design, its aesthetic appeal, its story, its rushed release, or anything else. but I come from a position of having played many indie games and knowing just how good and how bad they can be. Dark Deity is about average in that regard. When Dark Deity is compared to Fire Emblem, it's often given little to no wiggle room to fail. The successes of Dark Deity are attributed to its status as a Fire Emblem clone, and its failures are mysteriously only Dark Deity's fault somehow. Being able to solo the game with Lincoln is bad, but being able to solo practically any Fire Emblem game with the right character is just one of the quirks of Fire Emblem. Dark Deity was a buggy mess on release, but so was every Fire Emblem game. The story with logical inconsistencies and seemingly missing events is bad, but it's totally fine that there may be like 3.5 truly well-written stories in a 16-part series. When an independent studio with probably 1% of Intelligent Systems' budget, if that, makes a game almost as average as a typical Fire Emblem game, basically from scratch, with a solid tactical formula that usually works and is usually fun, with a story that doesn't make any shockwaves or say anything particularly meaningful, with a presentation that is pretty average for an indie game and not grating on the eyes or ears, that's not a sign that the studio is a failure. That's a sign that Intelligent Systems makes games that are as pretty as a Nintendo game can be, but with roughly the same amount of substance that an average mid-budget indie game has underneath it. As Intelligent Systems has more or less settled on its game design and narrative formulas and has basically decided to exterminate most signs of creativity outside of a few tweaks and a new feature or two from game to game, indie developers are just getting started with examining the games they grew up with, and they're thinking about how they could be better. And as more and more indie developers look to Fire Emblem as an inspiration, the probability that one of them will produce something that is not only just as fun, but actually more fun than Fire Emblem approaches 100%. And frankly, I look forward to that glorious day. Although I'm not completely happy with Dark Deity's design, I still want to see what Sword and Axe does in the future, since I doubt they think their game is perfect or anywhere close. At least I hope not. And I'm looking forward to seeing what other indie developers do to set apart their tactical RPGs from the giants. Not just as someone who enjoys indie games, and not just as someone who's thought about making one for a while, but as someone who wants to see something new in the tactical RPG genre with gameplay beyond rock, paper, scissors, and stories beyond replace bad king with good king. Hopefully, you want that too. That's it for me. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.